Any other thoughts before I dive in? All right. I'm not going to assume that everybody in the class fully understands the genetic paradigm. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of it and maybe tell you a couple interesting stories along the way. The whole notion of genetic modification, it seems like this is new, and it is within the realm of biotechnology, but humans have been guiding the genetics of organisms for a really long time. So, our forebears had no idea about genetics, what genetics meant. But they were still able to control the DNA or the genes of organisms by what Charles Darwin called selective breeding or artificial selection. All right, by picking out one out of a range and saying this is the one that we like. It has the traits we like, and then we prefer that one. We breed that one, and its offspring survive. Right, artificial selection. This was Darwin's contribution in the early 19th century. So I should have asked you guys if anybody knew what the first organism that our ancestors artificially selected, but instead of asking you, oh yeah, David, what?
Dogs.
Yes, it was the dog. Did anybody see this movie this past summer, Alpha?
Is it about breeding?
You should go see it. Maybe if I'm sure I won't have a class to kill, but it is worth seeing. It's pretty interesting. It's the story of how the first dog was, a fictionalized story, imagining how the first dog might have been domesticated out on the Mongolian plains. Yeah, the first organism to be domesticated was the Chinese native dog. It happened around 32,000 years ago. 32,000 years ago. A long time ago, folks. This is a picture of the Chinese native dog, which is apparently sort of the ancestor of all domestic dogs. The pugs, the chihuahuas, the shih tzus, the Boston Terriers, the boxers, bulldogs, and all of the rest came from this dog, or ancestors of this dog right here. All right. So at this time, though, humans were hunters and gatherers, and that's why they domesticated the dog to help with hunting, and because dogs were excellent hunters, right? The canids hunted in packs. They were pack animals, and so they acclimatized well to human packs and helped them hunt. But they were also gatherers at that time, and so humans started gathering grain at around 20,000 BC, a very long time ago. And there were these 8 Neolithic crops that we're not going to go through in detail, but one of them is shown here. This is einkorn wheat. Has anybody ever had einkorn before? Any of you gone to the Common Ground Fair? There's a lady at the Common Ground Fair that sells einkorn. I don't know if you know her booth, but she had all these like spruce boughs. She makes her booth out of spruce boughs and then sells this stuff that she grows, super ancient grain. Yeah, not. I mean, it's a type of wheat, right? It's not entirely dissimilar from hard red wheat that you might have. Kind of a nuttier flavor. Oops. So, yeah, it went. The ancients soon realized that these grains that they were collecting, they would store them for the winter, right? They would gather them and store them for the winter. And sometimes, they would dig pits. They would dig little pits and keep them in these pits, maybe in baskets or something like that, to keep them cool. So they stayed, viable longer. And some of them may have begun to sprout, right? And so they realized relatively soon that they could take these grains that they gathered and then sow them themselves, plant them themselves, till the soil, and plant them themselves. And there were these 8 Neolithic crops. So there was emmer and einkorn. These are grains, wheat, types of wheat that can be read about in the ancient Abrahamic texts. Barley, peas, lentils, something called bitter vetch, which is kind of like it's a legume, chickpeas, and then flax. It's interesting to look at these because humans' biology, our fundamental biochemistry, the way that our metabolism works, we shifted from a heavily meat-based diet when we were hunters, before we had the ability to have agriculture, and then we shifted to a carbohydrate centered diet right here. There's a lot of carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, a lot of starch in these grains. And over a long period of time, our biochemistry came to reflect that, came to reflect the ability we were selecting ourselves, the humans that could thrive on diets of wheat and barley and lentils and flax. It's not an accident that the oils that are in flax seed and the soluble mucins. Has anybody ever had flax seed before? They have it on the salad bars. Here's an experiment you can do sometime. Maybe we'll do it in the lab one day. You can take some of those the flaxseed, and you can put them in the bottom of a little glass or into a spoon and put a little bit of water in there, just some water, and then take it and set it next to your tray while you're eating lunch. Have your lunch, and then at the end, just enough to get them all wet, so they're sitting in a teeny tiny puddle, not soaking, but just a little puddle so they're wet. And then take that spoonful and just eat them. Put them in your mouth. See what it's like. You'll see that they have a weird, slimy, gelatinous coating. It's not that terrible. I'm making it sound bad. But the same with chia seeds, right? So these are soluble fibers that are extremely good for your GI tract, and it's not a mistake that our biology has become attuned to the nutrition that is in these Neolithic crops. All right. So here is some of the 3 ancient great civilizations. Of them, one of them is in the Fertile Crescent and the Nile River Valley, and then there was the Indus Valley along the western edge of the Indian subcontinent. And here are some clay figures from 9000 BC showing these oxen carrying clay pots that are meant to be full of grains that had been grown. So now, not only do we see grains, but we see domesticated animals, beasts of burden. Right? We see these longhorn oxen here pulling the plow behind this man from Egypt. We see it in the Indus Valley. And then further east, these are rice terraces that are many thousands of years old that are still active today in Guanyang County in Yunnan, China. Really, really beautiful landscape there that has been acutely managed for centuries, for many millennia. All right. On this continent, the South American continent, also ancient source of agriculture. There's a picture here of an Incan farmer using a foot plow. This is where coffee comes from. Or cacao. I'm sorry, not coffee. Coffee comes from Ethiopia, but cacao. So the chocolate and the peanut, cotton. Egyptian cotton actually is from the New World. Tomatoes. These are all crops that were first cultivated in the New World. All right. So what I'm heading towards here is this idea that there were about 10 global centers of origin for agriculture. 10 or 12, the number has varied, that were originally identified by this guy here named Nikolai Vavilov. Has anybody heard of him before? I'm going to tell you a little story about this guy. It's pretty interesting. So he was Russian and lived during the First and Second World Wars. He identified, he was a botanist that traveled all over the world. He traveled all over the world and was an adherent of the genetic theory proposed by Gregor Mendel. And we'll talk about Mendel in a moment. But Vavilov said that there were these 10 centers where agriculture arose orthogonally, like spontaneously. The people that were living there learned how to cultivate the plants that were in that environment. And so there were these independent sort of sprouts, so to speak, of agriculture that happened both in the New World and the Old. He had identified the Mediterranean, so Southern Europe and Northern Africa, as one of them. That has since been refuted, and they understand that agriculture from the Fertile Crescent had radiated out into the Mediterranean. And another one that he hadn't identified was Papua New Guinea. He sadly died before he was able to even visit Papua New Guinea. But let's talk about him a little bit more. He was a pretty amazing person. So he organized these expeditions and collected seeds, roots, tubers, fruits, and started the first seed bank on the world, like large-scale seed bank. And it was by far the largest, by orders of magnitude, than any other place on Earth at the time. He had in excess of 250,000 seeds, roots, and fruits collected. Here's a picture of the seed bank that was in St. Petersburg or Leningrad. It had been renamed Leningrad at the time. So an example of all the maize diversity that he had collected from North America, that as displayed in his office. Kind of a interesting story so far. Not that gripping. It's just this guy who's a scientist who's going out. Enter Trofim Lyshenko. Anybody heard of this guy? Probably not. You can just tell by the look in his eye that this guy is
like a villain.
This guy is certainly a villain. He is certainly a villain. So he completely rejected Mendelian genetics. This guy was not just a product of the Bolshevik revolution. What he was a product of was Stalinism. He was a product of Stalinism. Stalin came to power, and what this guy, and Russia had suffered enormous famine, particularly during World War I, right? There's like enormous famine. Stalin came to power. Lyshenko wanted to try to address the famine that was gripping Russia, but he also wanted to create a sort of new science that could be purely Soviet, a purely Soviet science that didn't rely on Western science and was in synchrony with Stalinist, communist, but particularly Stalinist ideology, the sort of like propaganda that Stalin was trying to pump out. So, for example, Lyshenko, his main idea was that traits were not inherited through genes. He completely rejected genetic theory and instead believed that genes were traits, not genes, traits were inherited through the environment. The environment that an organism lived in conferred the traits upon that organism. So I don't know how much philosophy any of you have had before, but this is going back to a guy named Lamarck in the early 19th century, the story of like the giraffe. Its neck grew long, not because of genes, but because of genes. Lamarck didn't know about genes, but he believed that it was because they were stretching their necks to reach the leaves on the top of a tree or something like that. Lushenko, for example, forced farmers to plant their seeds very close together, since according to his law, quote, his law of the life of species, plants from the same class never compete with one another. So you can see that this is sort of reinforcing the notion of communist class structure and like the Marxist ideology that's inside of this. He claimed that plants are self-sacrificing. They do not die to a lack of sunlight or moisture, but instead die so that healthy ones may live. And when they die, they deposit themselves over the growing roots to help the new generations survive. All right? So this was pseudoscientific pap, is what this was, that resonated with our pal Joe on the right-hand side there. That's Joseph Stalin. So, the Holocaust was one of humanity's great atrocities, great tragedies, right? For a number of reasons. One of them, just the sheer scale of it. 17 million people went to their deaths in the gas chambers. This guy's philosophy on how to grow plants led to the starvation of over 35 million people. 2 holocausts of people died because of this guy that nobody knows anything about. Because of his influence on Stalin, Stalin's like, yes, here is a new science, a Soviet science that helps me like cement my ideologies, right? They basically outlawed scientific dissent from his theories of environmentally acquired inheritance. In 1948, it was now illegal in Russia to disagree with Lushenkoism, the idea that, like, the basic science idea that genetics is where traits come from, was outlawed in Russia. And so in 1933, Morgan discovered the chromosome, and in 1953, DNA was discovered. But Lushenko, his influence was over Stalin throughout this entire time until Stalin's death, and well beyond it, in fact. So what were some of the consequences of this? First of all, our friend Vavilov, the actual scientist, the man of ideas that he was, finally couldn't take it any longer and stood up and said, Lushenko, you're wrong. You're just wrong. This is crap. This is not how it actually works. Because of that, he was sentenced to death in 1941. In 42, the sentence was commuted, and in 1943, prior to his death from starvation, so tragically, so ironically, his death of starvation in 1943 in prison, he issued over 150 lectures on agriculture in the prison that he was in. He continued to write as much as he was able while he was in prison, but he finally succumbed to starvation in 1943. A group of scientists who had been working with him at the Vavilov Institute. Let me back up. In 1941, the Nazis invaded Russia and laid former St. Petersburg, Leningrad, to siege. And you see this picture here of these people. This is the siege of Leningrad. In the background, that is called the Hermitage. Has anybody been to Leningrad here? It is the second largest art museum in the world. And at the time, it had perhaps the largest collection of art on Earth. And the Russians, when the Nazis laid siege to Leningrad, they hustled all this artwork out, right? Because it had wealth, and they were going to try to secure this resource. The seed bank was left on its own, as if it was worth nothing. And so the group of scientists at the Vavilov Institute had to protect the seed bank themselves with their own lives throughout the 28 months of the siege. 9 of them died of starvation, and still none of the seeds, while having eaten none of the seeds or tubers that they were protecting. So that is a pretty, it kind of makes me want to cry, a moving example of scientific dedication there in the face of horrible odds. Okay, we'll pick up there later. Vavilov's history turned his way. He was eventually, Lyshenko was disgraced with time, and Vavilov has his face on a stamp now. Yeah, cold comfort.